The platform smelled of oil and winter and something older, a salt and iron scent that belonged to trains and to long goodbyes. Maria sat where she had sat for 30 years, third bench from the ticket booth, beneath the old clock that always ran 10 minutes slow. Her coat was thick but threadbare. Her hands, folded around a thermos, were the color of pressed tea. Around her, the town woke in slow, reliable rhythms. A dog barked across the tracks. A coffee cart hissed. A commuter tugged his suitcase, mind already 3 destinations away. She did not come to watch arrivals. She came to keep a seat open in the universe. For strangers, it looked like habit. For those who knew the rumor, it looked like madness. For Maria, it was a promise, an obligation she had written on her bones the night the door had slammed. She had once folded that night into a single sentence. He left, and tried to live around it. Promises, she had learned, are slippery things. Waiting turns them into cliffs you stand on until your legs hurt. The first 300 steps of the morning were a ritual. She woke before light, boiled water, wrapped a sandwich in waxed paper she never ate, pinned a thin scarf her mother had knitted around her neck. She fingered the frayed edges of the photograph that lived in the inside pocket of her coat. A boy with a crooked smile and hair that had once refused to behave. He was 19 in the picture, shoulders still carrying the weight of adolescence. Not yet wearied by the world he would one day flee. In her hand, the photo grew warm. People in the diner used to point. Children used to whisper. After a while, the pointing softened into curiosity, and the curiosity hardened into a story that occupied small talk in grocery lines and faded conversations over mailboxes. She waits for the train that never comes. The story went, because people like stories with clear endings. Nobody liked the muddle of a life that kept going. The station itself had shrunk over the years. What had once been a bustling hub of whistles and ticket stubs had become something gentler and more stubborn. A place that held memories for a town that was slowly learning to forget. The paint peeled in honest strips. The timetable board showed fewer destinations. Sometimes, when the late afternoon sun struck the glass just so, the waiting room looked like a painting, soft edges, the kind you might want to step into and never return from. She watched the trains the way some people watch the sky, searching for patterns she could trust. Every horn, every sliding door, was a question. She had learned the schedules once and then unlearned them again, because hope is both precise and immune to lists. Often, strangers would ask her why she chose this bench. "It's comfortable," she would say, or "It's where the light falls in the morning." Sometimes she would tell them the truth. He sat here when he was a boy, and they would look quickly away, embarrassed, as if grief were contagious. On Thursdays, a municipal van parked by the loading bay, and an old man named Harris, who remembered the station when it had been grander and younger, shuffled over with a paper bag of stale donuts. He had been there the afternoon she'd come with a child pressed to her hip decades ago, and so he had made a sort of truce with Maria. He would bring pastry, and she would tolerate his long-winded memories. He had learned the best way to sit a story down was with a stale sugar crust. On other days, the high school kids would laugh and compare train times on phones that made more noise than the station. The sound of new lives never tired the station the way the absence of one did. Maria had been a small woman all her life, but the years had given her a kind of gravity. She moved with the careful economy of someone who knew the exact price of silence. Her hair, once black, had silvered in a pattern that made her look as if she carried the moon somewhere in the back of her head. Her eyes were quick and bright, the color of autumn leaves before they dry. They missed nothing. When a stranger walked with the inevitable slouch of someone used to hiding, her gaze would sharpen like a hand reaching for a pocket. There were nights she dreamed a million polite doors. In the dreamscapes, trains arrived with every possible story. Some brought apology letters. Some brought children who had grown into men who could not look at her. Sometimes the trains were empty, which hurt more. Sometimes they were full of people speaking in languages she felt she should know. When she woke, the dark was a presence in the room that matched the ache in her chest. She would check the clock, straighten the photograph once more, and then dress for the day as if she were stepping onto a stage. He had a name that fit the small town, a name she spoke to herself in the kitchen while folding linens and while scouring the counters. Daniel. Danny to the neighborhood kids. D. In scribbles on her shopping lists. Names can be practices before they are truths. She had practiced his so many times the sound of it had worn into the grain of her life, as if that repetition could hold him in the world. Sometimes, a train did bring someone who looked almost like him. Once, a delivery man with his jaw broken in the wrong way stepped off a freight, and she held her breath until he was gone. Once, a walk-in who smelled of diesel and country stopped, and she found her throat full of words she would not say. Each near miss salted the wound and made expectation more brittle. But hope is not a straight line. It is a habit. This morning, the platform was thin with people. A couple argued softly near the payphone. A teenager, headphones snug, practiced the choreography of being elsewhere. Maria sat with the thermos and the photograph, the town's small dramas swiveling around her like planets. The clock above the ticket window caught a sunbeam, and for a heartbeat, everything was ordinary in a way that felt like a forgiveness. That's when she noticed the man who had been watching the station from the curb, not quite part of the usual inventory of faces. He was younger than most of the commuters, maybe 30, with a notebook tucked under his arm and a camera bag that had seen more drives than flashbulbs. He carried curiosity like a badge, one of those people who ask questions as if they were small truths to be collected. He crossed the platform slowly, eyes polite and careful. "Good morning," he said, voice pitched to be agreeable. "Morning," she answered. Her voice was paper, and yet it held a tone that asked how seriously one would treat the ritual of waiting. "I'm with the county paper," he said, tapping the notebook. "Tom Reeves. I write small pieces. I've been coming around. There's a woman who sits here, I hear. People say she waits for someone. Thought I'd ask if I could talk to her." Maria looked at him the way she looked at trains, measuring, patient. This was the first time in 30 years someone had come with a pen, which meant they thought there might be a story, and stories were dangerous. They folded people into neat shapes and left little space for the ragged edges of life. "Sit," she said finally, though she did not move her hand for him to do so. "There's coffee in my thermos if you like it black." Tom sat anyway. He was younger than she expected, and there was something in the hollows at his temples that suggested he did not yet understand the weight of time. He unfolded a chair like it was a small bet against the world. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, which is a phrase people say when they already have an idea of how to hurt. I want to know what you want people to know." She smiled then, a quick thing, not quite warm. "I want them to know I am not waiting for the past. I am waiting for my son." Tom fumbled with his pen, the movement that journalists make when they are not sure whether to be actors or witnesses. The camera at his feet hummed like a resting animal. He wrote, "Woman waits for her son. 30 years. He didn't know, then, that the page he was opening was not a neat biography, but a knot. He didn't know that questions would pull like thread and reveal a life stitched together with small, stubborn acts of faith. Maria folded the photograph and slid it back into her pocket as if she feared the world might take it while she was not looking. The station clock kept its slow time. The train that mattered had not yet arrived. Or perhaps it was only a matter of learning to tell the difference between trains that carried people and trains that carried confession. Tom looked at her with a mixture of pity and professional hunger. "Can you tell me why he left?" he asked, the question wrapped in all the arrogance of the certain. She watched him, let the question sit in the air like steam over cold metal. For a long moment, she only listened to the station, to the clack of a rail, to a distant horn, to the slow creak of a bench. The truth, she knew, was a tide with a timetable of its own. It had once come in polite waves and then gone out to sea. She had learned that truth cannot be demanded like a train ticket. "No," she said finally. "I can tell you what I remember. I can tell you where he sat. I can tell you how the night smelled. But why? The why. That's a thing he took with him when he left. And I decided, years ago, that I would wait until he brought it home." Tom looked down at his notebook, as if the ink might change meaning if he stared hard enough. The pen paused above the paper, suspended between curiosity and the recognition that some doors, once closed, refused to open on command. Outside, a locomotive sighed. Maria settled deeper into her coat, as if the fabric might be a skin thick enough to keep out the world's opinion. She did not know that some stories find you a reporter, and that reporters find ways to open doors. She only knew that she had kept a place open for 30 years, and if keeping a place open required her to outwait a town, then she would do it. Tom closed his notebook and watched her, not yet understanding that the bench they sat beside held more than an absence. It held a promise stubborn enough to bend the arc of anyone who would listen. "May I come back?" he asked before the train moved and the morning rearranged itself into new errands. Maria looked at him, then at the tracks, then at the photograph warm against her ribs. She thought of all the times she had been asked to be smaller than she was and had refused. "If you mean to tell the truth," she said, "then come back. If you mean to wrap me in a neat ending for your paper, then don't bother." Tom folded his hands. "I want the truth." She watched him stand and chalk his shoes on the platform's grain. The day continued to spin, indifferent and steady. A train rolled by with a flume of white smoke and a clatter that sounded, for a moment, like a heartbeat. She did not move. She could not move. Waiting was a muscle atrophied by caution and preserved by stubbornness. On platform 3, under a clock that ran 10 minutes slow, Maria folded the remainder of her sandwich, tucked the photograph away, and set the thermos between her knees like an altar. The reporter walked away, leaving footprints that smelled faintly of coffee. Maria watched him go and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the particular, sharp hope of being seen. Tom Reeves had the face of someone who believed facts added up to truth. He liked lists, margins, neat conclusions. His notebook was a small cathedral of clipped sentences and tidy observations. He liked to think of himself as gentle with the stories he took on, an excavator who dug carefully so he didn't collapse the people he dug around. But there was an impatience to him, like a man waiting for an elevator that had promised to speed up but never did. He came back the following morning with a thermos of his own and a question already rehearsed. The station exhaled the same slow, stubborn breath as the day before. Maria greeted him as if she recognized his steps, the creak of his shoes, the habit of a man who thought returning proved seriousness. "Coffee," she offered. He took it gratefully, the steam fogging his glasses for a moment. He sat the camera bag at his feet and opened his notebook the way a man opens his palms, expecting something to appear. "I found your piece," she said before he could find the words. "You write good sentences." Tom blinked. He had not written anything yet. Not yet. "I wanted to, if it's all right." He stopped. She had a look in her eye, a soft but unyielding measurement neither flattery nor offense could shift. "You may ask," she said, "but understand, this is not an interview you can close with a headline." He understood. He did not fully understand how little he understood. He asked the questions journalists always ask first, the verifiable things that make an anchor. Where had she been born? Where had she worked? What did she do in the hours between raising a child and walking to the station? Maria answered with the easy precision of someone who had learned how to hand the world the pieces she wanted it to have. Facts steadied the air around them like stepping stones over a dark river. Then he asked about the night. He had rehearsed that one in the car on the way to the depot, in the red light outside the diner, while he sipped coffee that had gone cold. He expected anger or a sharply delivered summary of events. Instead, Maria gave him fragments. She offered him a memory like you might offer a shard of glass, sharp and dangerous and boasting of more skin than it could heal. It was loud, she said, not of the kind a train makes. It was the sound people make when a thing breaks that should not. He was young. He stood in the kitchen like someone who had swallowed a secret and could not cough it up. She closed her hands around the thermos as if holding the shape of the sound. Tom pressed gently. Did the police come? Was there an accident? She looked at him, and for a moment he saw the edge of something behind her eyes, like a window at dusk with shadows moving behind the glass. There were calls, she said. There were neighbors who said things in doorways. Someone knocked the basin off the counter in the middle of the night, and it shattered. Daniel went out. He took a bag. He left. He scribbled. The pen beat across the paper like the ticking clock. Around them, the station performed its quiet rituals. A loader waved a hand to someone across the tracks, a boy skidded past, and the sound of rubber on concrete made the hair on the back of Tom's neck prickle. It was all ordinary, and yet the ordinary walls could not hold the shape of what Maria carried. Did he leave a note? Tom asked. The journalist's question, small, specific, looked like a key. No, she said. Not for me. Neighbors. No, her voice thinned. Not for them either. He had thought the puzzle would be solved by a piece of paper, a police blotter. He had imagined himself finding rusted details and assembling them into a narrative that would sit cleanly under a photograph. Instead, He met silence that had weighed itself into habit. Tom felt the pull of the story then, not sensational, not immediately marketable, but heavy with human interest, the kind that made the county like a person at a bedside, leaning in. "Do you want me to look?" he began, and then corrected himself. "I mean, may I look into the records? If there are police reports, neighbors' statements. I could ask at the precinct." Maria considered, and for the first time since he'd met her, Tom sensed that part of the woman was a gatekeeper who held a map of when to open and when to hold fast. Her fingers toyed with the photograph in her pocket. "If it helps you," she said slowly, "look. But understand, there are things people say in years when they think a wound will come to a seam. They lie with kindness. They lie with shame. And sometimes, if you find a record, it's like putting your hand in water. Everything distorts." Tom's notepad filled with more than lines. He left the station that morning with a breast pocket heavy with civic curiosity and a feeling more visceral. A sense that the path he was about to walk had been walked by his own kind before. Men who dug into closets thinking they would find a code, and instead found a person. He began at the precinct because that was what was comfortable: official sources, public papers. The clerk behind the counter recognized him. Tom had written a piece about the town's summer fair once, and had been given the kind of small-town welcome that opened a few doors. He asked about reports filed 30 years prior. The woman clicked around the database and brought back microfilm, yellowing pages, and the sort of formality that years make: dates, names, hand-stamped notations. There was a report about a collision on Route 9 2 weeks earlier that year, not directly connected, and a noise complaint filed about a raucous party a month prior. There were notices about a stray dog and the name of a man who'd left town in a hurry, but none that mentioned a young man leaving after a fight. Tom left with photocopies and a new puzzle. Where nobody had made a record, perhaps someone had made an action. He began to visit the houses along the avenue where Maria had once lived. He introduced himself with practiced manners, and one by one people gave him small things: a photograph from a yard sale, a faded flyer for a dance where a young Daniel had been seen that summer, a half-remembered argument overheard from a porch. Each detail was a grain for a larger picture, and he felt as if he were in the business of assembling dust into portraits. At Mrs. Adler's house, the woman with the hydrangeas, Tom found a folded piece of paper wedged in the pages of an old cookbook. It was a list of names, a scrawled prayer, and in a corner a child's handwriting that read, D. He scanned it carefully, and for a moment, as he held the grocery list paper between his fingers, he felt the small, intimate loss that attaches to ordinary objects. When he returned to the station that evening, the light was different, longer, and more merciless. Maria sat where she always did, as if she had not moved through the day but had instead been the fulcrum around which all movement bent. She watched him with the careful attention of someone who knew the language of small changes. "You found something?" she asked. He handed her the grocery list paper carefully, like a man passing a relic. The look on her face when she saw the child's handwriting was not joy but a calibrated hurt, one that recognized the contours of what had been and what had been taken. "It's not much," Tom said, "but it's evidence that people in this town remember. That night is in more heads than we thought." She put the paper in her palm and smoothed it with 2 fingers, as if she wanted to flatten the years out. "People remember what they fear," she said. "They remember what helps them sleep. They remember what makes sense." Tom had an instinct to press. "Do you want me to find out more?" To ask. She looked at him then with a softness that could not be mistaken for acquiescence. "We must be careful," she told him. "There are kinds of curiosity that tear and kinds that mend. If you are going to look, look to mend." He had not expected the moral calculus. Journalists were usually rewarded for the force with which they pried. But Maria's request shifted his role from intruder to partner in an unwritten covenant. He promised, perhaps more to himself than to her, that his questions would not be jagged. That night, Tom sat at his desk and wrote the beginnings of a piece that was not an obituary nor an exposé. He wrote instead about patterns, about a town's armor against shame and a woman's improbable patience. He left blanks where names would go, places he would fill once he had permission to speak them aloud. Back at the station the following dawn, a yellow envelope lay partly tucked under the bench where Maria kept her thermos. It was the sort of thing found on errands, mislaid, or delivered with a deliberate hand. Tom saw it first. Maria's face turned, and she moved as if pulled by thread. She did not open it in front of him. She slipped it into her pocket with a gentleness that made Tom feel like an intruder in an exam room. He watched her fingers close over the paper, and then, as if a decision had been made, she stood up. "Come," she said softly. "If you're going to read it with me." They walked to the edge of the platform together, the reporter and the woman who had kept a bench warm for 30 years, and as a freight rolled past, the rhythm of wheels struck time. Tom followed because he had promised to mend, and because some promises were no longer just for paper. Maria pulled the envelope from her coat and turned it over in her hands, as if the paper itself might tell her whether to hope. She thought of the ways a town hides truth in gloss and rumor. She thought of the long list of mornings she had spent cataloging arrivals that were nothing to her but proof she had not surrendered. On the inside, she said, there might be a word, or there might be a stone. Tom held his breath. The station seemed, for a second, like the inside of a held hand, private, fragile, and full of weight. She slid her finger under the flap and broke the envelope's sleep. The paper inside unfolded with the sound of something tentative stepping into light. Tom read over her shoulder when she let him, but at the first line he saw the way her shoulders pitched and the way her mouth found a shape that had not been used in years. The letter did not say what he expected. It did not come with a confession or a clear promise. It read instead, "I remember the night. I remember the sound of the basin. I remember the way you hummed to yourself when you worried. I thought I had the courage to come back. I thought I had the right words. I am not ready yet. A friend." It was small, maddeningly small. Tom felt the journalist's hunger like a tightening in his chest. Maria folded the paper and put it back in her pocket as if she had reclaimed a small animal. "Someone remembers," she said, not a question but a fact filed away. Tom nodded, the itch of the story sharpening into a plan. He would follow the thread of this new handwriting. He would track the ink back to a hand. He would find out who had the courage to write and the fear to speak. He promised himself, find out whether the script belonged to a friend, an enemy, or to the uncertainty that keeps people apart. They sat on the bench until the light thinned to copper. The station's noises softened to a background murmur, less the business of travel than the hum of being. Maria watched the sun drown behind the warehouses, and for a breath, she looked almost like a woman who had been given a small, fragile reprieve. Tom closed his notebook with the deliberate care of a man who knew the value of what he carried. Not answers, but openings. He had not come to mend a life. He had come to witness one. But sometimes being a witness was how mending began. When he left that night, the station held its breath in a way that felt less permanent, as if something had shifted on the tracks. Maria tucked the folded scrap back into her pocket and smoothed her coat. The photograph pressed warm against her ribs. She had not yet been given a return. All she had been given was the sound of someone else's memory scratching at her door. "Come back tomorrow," she told Tom before he could say goodnight. He promised. He would, he thought, not only because of the story, but because for the first time in a long while he felt like he was part of a story that had a heartbeat. Tom couldn't sleep that night. The words from the letter wouldn't leave him alone. "I thought I had the courage to come back." The handwriting had a softness, a kind of trembling that told a story of hesitation. It wasn't a confident hand. It was someone afraid of being recognized, and yet desperate to be heard. He sat at his desk, the lamp burning into the early hours, scanning the photocopy he had made of the letter. He didn't tell Maria, but he had taken a photograph of it the moment she turned away to watch the train leave. It wasn't dishonesty, at least that's what he told himself. It was preservation. He couldn't help it. This was what he did. Capture, analyze, uncover. He zoomed in on the strokes. The way they are curled backward. The way the ink thickened slightly at the end of "friend." He remembered once working on a local forgery case, analyzing signatures for a story about an old bank clerk. People's handwriting betrayed them the way voices did when they lied. He compared it with an old form he'd copied earlier that day at the precinct, a census entry signed by Daniel Rhodes, Maria's son. It was 30 years old, written in the restless script of a 19-year-old boy. And then Tom froze. The capital R was the same backward curve, the same sharp flick at the tail. He leaned back in his chair, pulse hammering. If this was true, if Daniel himself had written that note, then the man who vanished 30 years ago wasn't gone. He was alive, watching, close enough to send a letter. But why not come home? He needed to tell Maria. But how? The next morning, Tom arrived at the station earlier than usual. Dawn was barely awake. Fog lay over the tracks like breath on glass. The air smelled of rust and wet gravel. Maria was already there, wrapped in her brown coat, thermos in hand, humming something faint and half-forgotten. "Morning," Tom said softly. She nodded, eyes still on the horizon. "You didn't sleep." He smiled thinly. "Neither did you." She didn't deny it. "The letter," she murmured. It felt like a heartbeat. He hesitated. He didn't want to crush that fragile hope with premature certainty, but hiding the truth felt worse. "I looked closer at it," he began. Maria turned her gaze to him, patient but alert. "The handwriting, it matches Daniel's." For a second, silence swallowed everything. The sound of a distant horn stretched across the tracks like something ancient and mournful. Maria didn't move. Her hand tightened around the thermos until her knuckles whitened. "You're sure?" she whispered. "I compared it to a census document from the town hall. The signatures, they're nearly identical." Her breath trembled. "Then he's alive." "It looks that way." She sat back against the bench, closing her eyes. Decades of stillness broke into something restless, a trembling in her shoulders, a hand covering her mouth. "All these years, I told myself he couldn't be gone. A mother knows. You know, Mr. Reeves. You just know." Tom didn't speak. The rawness in her voice didn't need a reply. He felt something tighten in his chest, a guilt, maybe, or awe. He wasn't used to being the messenger of miracles. "But why?" she continued. "Why write and not come?" Her tone darkened. What could keep a son from his mother for 30 years? Tom hesitated. Fear. Shame. Maybe he thought you'd hate him. Maria's eyes sharpened. "There is nothing he could do that I wouldn't forgive." He believed her. But he also knew human stories were never that clean. Sometimes forgiveness had nothing to do with what the other person could bear. Over the next week, the station became their meeting place. Tom brought folders, records, photocopies. Maria brought memories, fragments of Daniel's childhood, things that might now seem like clues. The way he always folded his notes in thirds. The habit of drawing birds in the margins. Tom collected these details with reverence. One morning, she brought an old photo, Daniel standing next to a beat-up blue Chevy, grinning, one arm slung around a friend whose face was half out of frame. "Do you remember his name?" Tom asked. Maria shook her head. "No. Daniel had many friends that year. But that one." She leaned closer, squinting. "That's Sam. Sam Weller. They worked together at the docks." Tom scribbled the name down. "Still live in town." He moved away. "California, maybe?" After that night. That night. The words hung in the air again. Thick, unfinished. Tom didn't press. He knew she wasn't ready to relive it yet. Instead, he focused on the letter. He ran a background check, called in favors from an old editor in the city. 2 days later, something new landed on his desk, a postal routing trace. The letter had been mailed from Bridgeport, a small industrial town only 60 miles away. Daniel was close. Tom drove there the next day. Bridgeport was gray and tired, its streets lined with old warehouses and tired diners. He checked into a cheap motel, the kind with flickering neon signs and carpet that smelled faintly of cigarettes. He spent the day visiting post offices, showing the letter to clerks, asking if anyone recognized the handwriting on the envelope. Most didn't. One woman, however, paused longer than the others. "That handwriting," she said slowly, "I've seen it. A man comes by sometimes, maybe twice a month, sends letters. Always pays in cash. Quiet type." Tom's pulse quickened. "Do you know his name?" She shook her head. "No, but he's older. Gray hair. Walks with a limp, maybe. Wears a blue jacket." A chill moved through Tom. Daniel would be in his late 40s now. Old enough to have gray hair. Old enough to limp. The clerk looked thoughtful. "You a cop?" Tom hesitated. "No, just a friend." That night, he sat in his motel room staring at the note again. "I thought I had the courage to come back." He wondered if Daniel had been writing from Bridgeport all along, watching from a distance, waiting for something that never came. The next morning, he went back to the post office. He parked his car across the street and waited. The hours dragged. Afternoon sun climbed and began to fall again. Just when he thought he'd wasted his day, a man appeared. Mid-40s, gray at the temples. Blue jacket. He moved with a slight limp, holding a small envelope. Tom's breath caught. He followed him discreetly as the man dropped the letter into the mailbox. The envelope slipped inside with a soft thud, the kind of sound that changes lives. Tom stepped closer, enough to glimpse the return address written faintly on the back. D. Rhodes, Bridgeport, Connecticut. His throat went dry. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. The name said everything. Daniel Rhodes was alive, and he was writing to his mother. Tom drove back to the station that evening, his hands trembling on the wheel. He could barely contain it. The truth he was about to deliver. When he arrived, Maria was there as always. She looked up when she saw him, sensing something different in his step, his breath. "What did you find?" she asked. Tom knelt beside the bench, lowering his voice. "He's alive, Maria. I saw him. I followed him. He's in Bridgeport." Her eyes widened, and for the first time in 30 years, the hope she'd guarded like a flickering candle became a flame. But before Tom could say more, she whispered, voice breaking, "Then why hasn't he come home?" The next train roared past, wind whipping through her hair, carrying her question into the night. Tom didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he knew he would find one, even if it meant unearthing what really happened that night. The platform smelled of rain that morning, a sharp metallic tang clinging to the air, and Maria could not remember ever being so alive and so alone at the same time. The revelation that Daniel was alive had struck like a flare, burning away the residue of 30 years of quiet grief, leaving her raw, unsteady, yet impossibly alert. Tom Reeves had delivered the news with careful restraint, like a surgeon handling a fragile organ. "He's alive," he said. That was all. He had not said why, had not said how, had not given her the keys to understand the years he had stolen. Maria folded her hands in her lap and stared across the tracks, where the distant city skyline shimmered in the morning haze. The trains passed like ghosts, and in their wake came memories she had kept locked in a drawer for decades. She remembered the night he left as though it were happening again. The rain had beaten against the windows in staccato bursts, drumming a rhythm that made her heart pound in time with it. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast and the faint, bitter tang of old coffee, the remains of her half-asleep attempts to keep the household functioning. Daniel had been restless, pacing back and forth with the kind of tension that only a teenager carries, the belief that the world was simultaneously too small and impossibly cruel. She remembered the way his fists had clenched and unclenched, the flash of his jaw in the dim light, the uncertain way his gaze darted toward the door. She remembered her husband's voice, sharp and hard, slicing through the storm like a knife. Words were exchanged, too many, too angry, too fast. She could not recall the specifics now, only the weight, the fury, the feeling of inevitability. Something had shattered that night. She had felt it before she even saw it. A basin overturned, water spilling like a prelude to loss. And then he was gone. She could still hear the sound of the door slamming behind him, the finality of it. The click of the latch had sounded louder than the train whistles that never came in time. And in that sound, she had understood that a life had been divided into before and after. Tom watched her from a respectful distance, notebook resting on his knee, pen poised but quiet. He did not push, though he burned to ask the questions that would unravel decades. How old had Daniel been? What had they argued about? Why had he left and not looked back? Maria's eyes were fixed on a train disappearing over the horizon. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "I didn't understand it then, the why of it. I tried to, but some things a mother cannot know until the child returns." Tom could only nod. He felt like a witness to a confession that hadn't yet been completed. He knew that forcing the story now would crush it into something flat, like pressing a bloom under glass. Some stories needed patience. Some stories demanded time. The station seemed to shrink around her, the mist curling like smoke from long-extinguished candles. Every sound felt magnified. A distant horn, the scrape of a suitcase wheel, the faint echo of voices carried across the tracks. Each ordinary noise reminded her of the night Daniel had left. She recalled the small details no one else remembered. The worn patch on his favorite jacket, the way his shoes squeaked against the wooden floor, the smell of rain-soaked hair that had haunted the kitchen even after he had disappeared. These fragments were pieces of a puzzle that only now, with him alive, might be assembled into something whole. Her memory held him as he had been, young, fierce, terrified, and yet resolute. She had tried to forgive the act itself, the leaving, even as the questions without answers tore through her like wind through the eaves. Every year she sat on this platform, she rehearsed the possibilities. He had been taken, or hurt, or simply forgotten. None of them felt true. Some instinct had always whispered that he had left with intent, carrying secrets she could not yet bear. Tom finally spoke, gently. Do you want to go back? To that night. She shook her head, almost imperceptibly. Not yet. I can feel it, though. The edges of what happened, they are still there. Sharp. I can see him pacing in the kitchen, hear my husband shouting. I can hear the storm outside. But I cannot reach the reason why he left. Not yet. He wrote it down anyway, carefully. He felt like a cartographer mapping a coast without ever touching land. He understood, in a new way, the weight of absence. The kind that stretches across decades and fills ordinary objects with extraordinary meaning. The day wore on with the muted rhythm of rain falling through the city. People moved past without noticing her, and sometimes she envied their ignorance, their ability to be untouched by decades of unanswered questions. Yet she could not envy them for long. Every train whistle reminded her that she was alive, that she was waiting, that hope could not be extinguished so easily. At the end of the day, as dusk crept over the tracks, she felt a small stir of resolve. The letter had arrived. Daniel was alive. And while she did not yet know why he had disappeared, she now understood that some truths could only be confronted face to face. The waiting would continue, but now it carried a different weight. Not despair, but preparation. She would wait, yes, but she would also watch, and listen, and learn to recognize the moment when the boy who had left became the man who was coming home. That evening, she folded her coat, tucked the photograph against her chest, and whispered into the wind. Soon, Daniel, soon, you will tell me everything. The train whistle cut through the twilight like a promise and a question all at once. Tom, notebook in hand, knew that the story was shifting, that the chapters ahead would be hard, and that the night Daniel left would finally begin to speak. But for now, the night held its silence, keeping its secret carefully as the platform emptied into darkness, leaving Maria alone with hope and memory. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet concrete and distant pines. Maria arrived at the station earlier than usual, her steps echoing on the platform's worn boards. The thermos in her hand steamed softly, a small promise of warmth against the chill. Today felt different. There was a tension in the air, subtle but unmistakable, like the first note of a song you've waited decades to hear. Tom Reeves was already there, camera bag slung over one shoulder, notebook in hand. He had a habit of arriving early, claiming it was to observe light angles for photographs, but Maria knew better. He came because he, too, sensed that something was about to change. Morning, he said, voice cautious. Any news from Bridgeport? Maria shook her head, eyes scanning the empty tracks. Not yet, but I feel it today. Something is coming. Her words were soft, almost a whisper, yet they carried the weight of 30 years of waiting. Tom watched her with growing awe. She had carried hope like a secret flame, and it had never wavered. Mid-morning, a courier arrived at the station, a small man with an envelope in his gloved hands. For Mrs. Rhodes, he said, bowing slightly. Maria took the envelope without a word, her hands trembling as she recognized the handwriting immediately. The looped cursive, the slight tilt of the letters, the careful spacing, it was unmistakable. Tom leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse without seeming intrusive. Maria's lips parted slightly, a breath caught between disbelief and hope. She held the envelope as if it were a fragile bird, afraid it might fly away before she could read it. She slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the paper with deliberate care. The words, written in that familiar script, seemed to vibrate with life. Mother, I never stopped thinking of you. I have been far, but always near in thought. I cannot come yet. Not until I can tell you everything. But I promise I will return. Please wait for me. Daniel. Maria's heart pounded so violently that she could feel it in her throat. 30 years of silence, of absence, of unanswered questions were encapsulated in a single page. Tears blurred her vision, and for a moment, she could not breathe. Tom reached out, hesitant. Maria? She waved him off gently. Not yet. This is mine. She folded the letter, pressing it against her chest, and closed her eyes. The station, the tracks, the distant hum of the city, all seemed to recede, leaving only the pulse of hope and memory intertwined. She read it again, this time aloud, though softly, almost to herself. I never stopped thinking of you. The words were simple, but for Maria, they were monumental. They carried the weight of remorse, of longing, of a son who had been absent yet present in spirit all these years. Every sentence, every carefully chosen word, told her that Daniel had remembered, that he had not forgotten, that he had never truly left. The letter did not explain why he had gone, nor did it attempt to justify his absence. It only offered acknowledgement, and that was enough to ignite a fragile hope. The fire in her chest flickered and grew, small but unyielding. Tom watched silently, aware that this was not a story to report yet. This was a moment to witness, to hold reverently, without interference. Over the next few days, Maria returned to the station, the letter always in her coat pocket. She reread it in private, each reading revealing new layers of emotion. The promise that he would come back, that he would tell her everything, anchored her in a way she had not felt in decades. At night, she would lie in bed, eyes open, imagining his return. The trains in her dreams no longer carried emptiness, they carried possibility. She pictured him stepping off the platform, older but recognizable, hesitant but determined, and the thought made her hands tremble. The letter also stirred memories long buried. The sound of rain on the kitchen roof that night he left, the echo of his footsteps, the way the light had fallen across his hair. She realized that even in absence, he had never truly left her mind, nor had he left her heart. Tom began to help her in small ways, tracing old addresses, checking train schedules, and gently probing for clues about the past. He never asked about the reason Daniel had gone. He understood that some truths could not yet be touched. Maria, for her part, felt both exhilarated and terrified. The letter was a lifeline, but it also raised questions that had no answers. How far had he gone? What had he experienced? And most painfully, why had he waited so long to write? Yet the letter was undeniable proof. Daniel was alive. He remembered her. He wanted to return. And for the first time in 30 years, Maria allowed herself to believe, not just hope, that she would see him again. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, she sat on the bench, the thermos between her knees, the letter pressed against her heart. The station was quiet, save for the occasional train whistle in the distance. Maria breathed deeply, feeling the tension of decades slowly ease, replaced by anticipation. Tom stood nearby, notebook closed, observing. He had learned that sometimes stories did not need to be captured in words. They needed to be felt. Maria whispered into the fading light. "Soon, Daniel. Soon, I will see you." And somewhere, out there, Daniel Rhodes was alive, watching, waiting for the courage to finally come home. The station was colder than usual that morning. Frost had crept along the edges of the benches and coated the railings with a thin, brittle layer of ice. Maria walked toward her usual spot, thermos in hand, feeling a nervous flutter she had not known in decades. Every morning was the same, yet today felt different, as if the air itself had been waiting for something. Tom Reeves was already there, leaning against a pillar with his camera bag at his feet. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Morning," he said. "You're early." She nodded, scanning the platform with careful eyes. "I feel it," she admitted. "Something is coming." They had been meeting like this for weeks now, sharing time, memories, letters, but the anticipation of what might finally appear gave the morning an edge that neither of them could shake. Around mid-morning, a figure appeared at the far end of the platform. He was not Daniel. She would have known immediately, but there was something familiar in the posture, the gait, the way his eyes scanned the tracks. He wore a blue jacket and moved with a slight limp, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch Tom's attention immediately. "Do you see him?" Tom whispered. Maria nodded slowly. "Yes, but he's not Daniel." The man stopped a few paces away, checking the timetable as if he had a purpose, yet he didn't board any train. Maria's heart beat faster. Her instinct told her that this was someone connected, perhaps a messenger or a witness, someone who had been waiting in the shadows of her life all these years. Tom took out his notebook, hands steady despite the thrill in the air. He scribbled, "Stranger at platform. Blue jacket. Limp." Watching, Maria's eyes did not leave the man. Something in his stance, the tilt of his head, reminded her of a photograph she had tucked away years ago. Daniel with a friend on the docks, laughing carelessly before the storm of that fateful night. The stranger walked closer, finally stopping just beyond the bench where Maria sat. He carried a small envelope, worn and familiar-looking, almost identical to the letter from Bridgeport. He held it out with care, as if offering something sacred. Maria hesitated. The envelope felt heavier than it should. She reached for it, hands trembling, and opened it slowly. Inside was a single note, written in a hand she didn't recognize. "I'm here to help her. She doesn't yet know the full truth. Be careful what you ask, and listen before you speak." Maria's heart pounded. The note was cryptic but undeniable. Someone had been watching over her, guiding the steps of Daniel's return, keeping secrets meant to protect. Tom leaned closer. "Do you know who this is?" Maria shook her head. "No, but I feel like someone has been guarding him. Or me. Maybe both." For hours, the stranger remained nearby, never approaching directly, only observing, as if ensuring that the fragile moment of reunion remained intact. Maria and Tom exchanged glances, the unspoken agreement between them growing heavier. This was a story far more complex than either had imagined. Finally, the man left as quietly as he had arrived, slipping into the shadows beyond the station. The envelope, the note, and the presence of the stranger left Maria with more questions than answers. Who was he? How much did he know? And why now, after 30 years, was the truth being guided into the light so carefully? That evening, Maria sat alone on the platform. The letter from Daniel rested in her coat pocket, warm against her heart. The new note, from the stranger, was folded beside her thermos. She reread it endlessly, trying to untangle the implications. She could feel the weight of what was coming. Soon, she realized, the questions she had carried for decades would demand answers. And yet, she also sensed that some truths were deliberately being held back, preserved for a moment when they could be revealed safely. For the first time in 30 years, the station did not feel like a place of waiting. It felt like a stage, set for the performance of fate, the moment when a mother would meet the son she had lost, and the story of why he left would finally begin to unfold. Maria closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and whispered into the cold night. "Show me, whoever you are. Show me the path to him. Show me the truth." The wind stirred in response, carrying the sound of distant rails, the promise of a train, and the silent rhythm of a story that was far from over. The sun had barely risen when Maria arrived at the station. The chill in the air carried the scent of frost and wet earth, a smell she associated with beginnings and endings all at once. Her heart thumped in her chest, a rhythm she had not felt for decades. Today, she knew, could change everything. Tom Reeves followed quietly, keeping a respectful distance. He sensed the weight of the moment, the kind of instant that demanded patience, not intrusion. He had witnessed many reunions in his career, but something about this one carried the quiet power of decades, a resonance that could not be captured in photographs or notes. Maria sat on the familiar bench, hands gripping her thermos, eyes scanning the tracks with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Every train that passed made her pulse quicken, every whistle a pang of expectation. She didn't know which one would carry him, only that one day it would. And then she saw him, a man, mid-40s, gray at the temples, walking slowly across the platform. His gait was familiar, the same slight limp she had glimpsed in the stranger. Blue jacket, worn jeans, cautious movements. But above all, the presence of someone she recognized instantly. Daniel, her son, alive, her breath caught. 30 years of absence, of unanswered questions, of waiting, condensed into a single moment. She rose from the bench, heart racing, unsure whether to run to him or stay frozen in disbelief. Daniel paused when he saw her. His eyes widened, a mixture of shock, relief, and fear. The letters had been his attempt to bridge the distance. But standing here, face to face, he realized that decades of absence could not be undone with a few words. Maria took a tentative step forward. "Daniel." Her voice trembled, fragile yet insistent. He swallowed hard. "Mother." His voice was low, roughened by years, yet unmistakably his own. They stopped a few feet apart, unsure how to close the space that 30 years had carved between them. Tears welled in Maria's eyes, blurring the platform and the tracks beyond. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to hold him, but she hesitated, fearing the moment might shatter. Tom watched silently, notebook closed. This was not a story for words. It was a living, breathing miracle unfolding before him. Daniel finally moved, slowly, deliberately, and took her hands in his. The warmth of his palms, the familiar grip of fingers she had once known, sent shivers down her spine. For a moment, the world contracted to the space between them. The distance, the years, the silence, all melted away in the immediacy of their connection. "I've thought of you every day," Daniel whispered. "I never stopped." Maria's tears fell freely now. "I waited," she said. "Every morning. 30 years. I never stopped either." They embraced, the platform around them fading, leaving only the quiet echo of footsteps and the soft hum of distant trains. Time seemed to bend, folding past and present into a single, intense moment of recognition and relief. Yet even as relief filled her, questions surged beneath the surface. The reason for his disappearance, the act that had taken him from her life, remained hidden. His letters hinted at secrets, at fear, at unspoken burdens, but they did not explain. Daniel pulled back slightly, looking at her with an expression that combined longing and hesitation. "I need to tell you everything," he said. "But not yet. Not until I know you're ready. Some things are better spoken when the heart is steady enough to hear them." Maria nodded, understanding the weight behind his words. 30 years had taught her patience, taught her that truth arrived in its own time. She could wait a little longer, though the ache of curiosity throbbed in her chest. Tom, observing from a short distance, felt the tension of unfinished revelations. The story was far from over, but the reunion itself was profound, a turning point in both their lives. As the morning sun climbed higher, mother and son walked along the platform together, hands occasionally brushing, sharing silent understanding. Words were not necessary. The bond that had been tested by decades of absence, letters, and longing was alive again. Maria carried the letter in her pocket, pressing it against her heart. Daniel's presence beside her was proof that even the most prolonged separations could be overcome. And yet, the shadow of the past lingered. The why behind his disappearance hovered like an unspoken question in the air. They knew it could not be ignored forever. The station, now bathed in soft golden light, seemed to witness their reunion in quiet approval. Trains rolled past, indifferent to the decades of waiting, indifferent to the pain and hope that had converged on this platform. But for Maria and Daniel, the world had narrowed to this single moment, fragile and luminous. Maria whispered softly, almost to herself, "Soon, we will understand. Soon, I will know why." Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting the mix of fear and determination that had kept him away all these years. He had returned, but the story of that night, the real reason he left, remained unspoken, poised for the final revelation. And Tom, silently observing, realized that the greatest stories were not always about facts or events, but about the slow unveiling of truth, the patient stitching together of hearts torn apart by time. The station was quiet that evening, the sun setting behind the distant warehouses, painting the tracks in shades of gold and copper. Maria and Daniel stood side by side on the familiar platform, the letters and notes from the past weeks pressed safely in her coat pocket. Tom Reeves lingered a few steps back, respecting the intimacy of the moment. Daniel drew a deep breath, the weight of decades pressing down on him. His eyes met his mother's, and for the first time, he allowed the shadows of the past to surface. "I owe you the truth," he said softly. "All of it. You deserve that after 30 years of waiting." Maria nodded, her hands trembling but steady, gripping his. "I'm ready," she whispered. "I've waited this long. I can bear it now." Daniel began, his voice shaking at first, then growing steadier as he poured out the story he had carried alone for 30 years. "That night, the night I left, something happened that I couldn't tell you then," he said. "I got involved with people I thought I could trust. People who promised opportunity, adventure, a way to escape the small life I felt trapped in. I wanted to protect you from the danger I was getting into, so I left. I thought I could handle it alone, that I could come back when it was safe. But things went wrong. Everything went wrong. I couldn't come home. I was afraid you'd be hurt, afraid you'd hate me for leaving, afraid I'd never be able to make it right. Maria's eyes filled with tears. She had felt a part of this for decades, the absence, the silence, but hearing it aloud, she realized how heavy the burden had been on her son. Daniel, she said, voice trembling, you never left me in my heart. Not for one day. I waited because I knew. I always knew you were alive somewhere. He shook his head, emotion choking him. I know. And I'm so sorry. Every day I was gone, I thought about how you must have suffered. I thought about leaving letters, sending signs, but I didn't have the courage. I thought I could fix it myself before you knew. Maria reached out, cupping his face. You are here now, she said, voice firm. That's all that matters. We will face everything together, the past, the years lost, everything. Daniel nodded, a tear rolling down his cheek. I was foolish, but every step I took, I never stopped hoping you'd still be waiting. And you were. You always were. Tom watched silently, notebook closed. This was not a story to record. This was a story to witness, to honor. The reunion, the truth, the forgiveness. All of it unfolded like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For a long time, mother and son stood on the platform, holding each other, letting the years of absence dissolve into the evening air. The letters, the notes, the stranger, all pieces of a puzzle that had led them here, were now no longer needed. The truth had been spoken, the past faced, and a fragile peace settled over them. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I will never leave like that again. I promise you. We have too much to share, too much to live for. Maria smiled through her tears. And I'll never stop waiting for you. But I won't have to anymore. The train tracks stretched ahead, endless and gleaming in the last light of day. The platform, once a place of longing and silent vigil, had become a place of reunion and new beginnings. Daniel and Maria walked together toward the station exit, hands intertwined, the burden of 30 years lifting with every step. Behind them, the station seemed to sigh, the echoes of waiting finally at rest. Tom followed, quietly reflecting that some stories are not about the disappearance or the letters or even the decades of absence. They are about the patience, the hope, and the courage to finally face the truth. And as the last train whistle echoed across the empty tracks, it carried not sorrow, but relief, forgiveness, and the promise of a future finally shared.